pregnant widow, about to be hanged for stealing to feed her kids, saved by a reclusive rancher with a broken past. Don't forget to hit that like button. Leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear what part touched you the most. And hey, don't stop here. The next chapter is even deeper. The year was 1878, and the silence of the Texas plains was a living thing, not the kind of quiet that soothes a man to sleep, but the sort that crawls up your spine and settles behind your eyes, making a home of the hollow places you didn't know were empty until you'd been left alone with nothing but the wind and your own thoughts. For Nathan Blackwood, the man folks didn't talk to but never stopped talking about. That silence had become both a companion and a sentence, something he carried like an old injury that never fully healed, though it didn't bleed anymore. They said he was touched by the war, or maybe by the loss of that sweet young wife buried under the red earth on his back acres, the one who died screaming in the dark, while he once, a fine surgeon by all accounts, sat shaking beside her hands, as useless as firewood in a storm. They said he kept ghosts for company, now that he talked to the walls, or the wind, or maybe to the memories that still clung to the corners of his house, and though no one dared speak it to his face, redemption had long since written him off as a broken man, too rich to pity and too strange to trust. So when he rode into town that morning, coat drawn tight, face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, boots silent against the frost-hardened mud, no one said a word to him, but every eye followed not out of welcome, but out of habit, the way one watches a hawk circling above, unsure whether it hunts or merely drifts. And yet what he found waiting in the square was not what he came for. The gallows had been built fast, rough-cut pine with the smell of sap still clinging to its beams, and the rope thick brown and coiled like a lazy serpent, swayed gently in the morning wind that carried snow like ash and bit the skin clean through wool and leather alike. Eleanor Hayes. Sheriff Holt's voice rang out steady and cold. You've been found guilty of stealing provisions from the town storage. Given the shortage, the councils ruled this as a crime against the settlement's survival. No one cheered. No one cried. This wasn't a spectacle. It was what passed for justice when snow was up to the windowsills and babies cried through the night for milk that wouldn't come. She opened her mouth. "Please," she said, and her voice was so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind itself. "I got 2 boys, up in the mountain. They're just children, 8 and 6. I left them wrapped in elk hide with barely enough kindling to last the night. I had no choice. We had no food left. I only took what we needed to keep from freezing and starving." Her hands trembled as she took a step forward, belly straining against her coat, her whole body a trembling thing on the edge of collapse. "I'm carrying another," she added, her palm moving to rest on the curve of her stomach, as if to shield the child from what came next. "This one ain't even had a chance yet." There was a pause, the kind that hangs just long enough to let hope crawl in before someone stomps it out. Sheriff Holt didn't even look at her. He kept his hand on the lever face blank as fence post would, and said in a voice that sounded more memorized than meant, "The law don't make exception for desperation, ma'am. Everyone's struggling. You broke the code. You knew the risk." "I didn't steal for myself." Eleanor's voice rose sharper, now edged with panic. "I ain't asking for mercy. I'm asking for sense. My boys'll die without me. You let me hang, you're killing 4 souls, not just 1. Please, Sheriff, have a heart." "We ain't hanging hearts today." He cut in dry as old bones. His gaze flicked over the crowd who stood like statues under falling snow, their eyes flat, their mouths tight, all pretending her words hadn't just clawed their way into their ribs. The council voted unanimous. We follow the law same for all. If we start bending rules every time someone's got a sad story, we'll have ourselves a lawless winter. But I'm with child. Which means the town saves rope, Holt said, and with that, he turned back to his duty, his glove tightening on the lever as if he could silence her by muscle alone. And just like that, the air shifted, not colder, not louder, just heavier, as if the whole square held its breath. She heard the creak of rope as the sheriff approached the lever. She bowed her head. And then a voice, low and steady, cut the air like a saw against ice. "That's enough." Heads turned. Eleanor looked up. A man stood at the edge of the crowd, coat long and dark hat pulled low over his brow. Snow clung to his boots like he'd come straight from the edge of the earth. And in a way he had. Nathan Blackwood stepped forward, leather gloves tucked under his belt, papers folded in one hand. "I invoke the Frontier Labor Act of 1871. It wasn't shouted, just said plain, but it sliced through the morning like an axe splitting seasoned wood. All heads turned, even Sheriff Holt's hand paused mid-reach. A tall figure stepped forward from the edge of the square. His coat was dark, stiff with frost at the hem, and the brim of his hat shadowed most of his face. But folks knew the shape well enough. Nathan Blackwood, the recluse from the Blackwood Ranch, the ghost in human clothes. He moved like a man used to having room made for him, not with swagger, but with gravity. And when he reached the platform, he held out a folded paper, the official seal of Pine Creek, catching a glint of gray light. "This woman qualifies under Section 4, Paragraph 3. Nathan said, his voice as cold and even as the snow crunching beneath his boots. "She's committed no violence. She stole food, and according to the Act, during times of territorial strain, nonviolent criminals can be remanded to labor service." Holt blinked hard, frown etched deeper with every word. "That law's meant for debtors," he said, but his tone had lost the sharpness it had carried minutes before. "It extends to others in need of sentencing alternatives. Sheriff, the law doesn't specify the gender of the laborer or the type of property requiring maintenance. My land is underworked. I have livestock that needs tending, and I have no one else to do it." He nodded toward Eleanor, still shaking her face now, a mask of shock more than fear. "She's pregnant. Her husband's dead. Letting her hang won't feed the town or warm your winter." The crowd didn't speak, but something in the air shifted, not quite sympathy, not yet, just uncertainty. The sheriff took the document, scowling, and stepped down off the gallows. His eyes flicked back and forth between the seal and the signature, reading slow, like a man hoping the ink might vanish if he stared long enough. Eleanor stood frozen, unsure whether to believe what was unfolding. The noose still hung beside her. Her feet were still on the trap door. But something had shifted, something real. Holt's jaw worked as he handed the paper back to Nathan. "It appears to be in order," he admitted, the words thick in his mouth like gravel. Nathan gave a short nod. "Then I'll take custody." "She's your responsibility now," Holt added, loud enough for all to hear. "Any trouble she causes'll be on your head." Nathan didn't answer that. Instead, he turned his eyes up to Eleanor. The sheriff exhaled, slow. "You sure you want that, Blackwood? She's your responsibility now?" "I'm aware," Nathan said. The sheriff turned. "Get the rope off her." She nearly collapsed when the noose came loose. Her knees gave a little, and the deputy caught her elbow, helping her down from the box. When her boots touched earth again, she stared at Nathan like she was trying to see through him. He met her eyes, didn't smile, didn't blink. "If you run," he said quietly, "they'll hang you anyway. Best you come with me." She nodded, throat too tight for words. A strange sound, not quite a cry, not quite a breath, escaped her lips. Nathan turned, started walking. She followed. The crowd opened for them like parting sea. No one said a word. The silence stretched long and strange, not judgmental anymore, just confused. Who was this man? Why had he saved her? Nathan's wagon waited at the edge of town, dusted with snow. The bay mare stood still in her harness, steam curling from her nostrils, her ears flicking at nothing in particular. The world was quiet, in that way it only gets when cold settles into bone, and even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. Eleanor climbed up slowly, one hand on the edge of the bench, the other cradling her side. She didn't ask for help, and Nathan didn't offer. When she was seated straight-backed and stiff, he climbed up beside her and took the reins in gloved hands. He gave the mare a small nudge, and they started off, wheels groaning, wood creaking, and snow crunching beneath them like bones. Neither spoke. Not at first. Not for a long while. The town of Redemption shrank behind them with every turn of the wheels, its false justice and quiet cruelty fading into distance. But Eleanor's thoughts couldn't leave it just yet. They circled heavy and sharp around the faces in the crowd. Not angry faces, not hateful, just tired, resigned, indifferent. And that was somehow worse. Her eyes flicked toward the tree line in the far distance where the mountains began to rise like forgotten gods. Somewhere out there, tucked between rock and frozen wind, her sons were waiting. Daniel 6, always too quiet. Matthew 8, with shoulders already learning to carry more than they should. She had left them with everything she could. Dried meat, 2 furs, and fire coals packed in ash, but she knew how cold it had turned the night before. She knew how long snow could bury a cave, how quickly a small child's cough could become something that didn't go away. The silence inside the wagon wasn't just between them. It was around them, above them. Even the wind seemed to stay low, dragging itself through the brush instead of screaming across the ridges. This land, this season, it stripped things bare. Wood, skin, truth. Nathan didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the road ahead, but she could feel the weight of his awareness like a man used to watching for movement at the edges of things. After a while, she spoke. "Is your ranch far?" He nodded barely. "Few hours yet." "That's good," she said mostly to herself. "Gives me a little time to figure out what comes next." He didn't answer. The sun moved behind clouds. The shadows changed. They rode on. By the time they pulled up to the ranch, the light had begun to fade in that quiet, creeping way winter does, like it's being stolen minute by minute. Eleanor blinked at the sight of it. It wasn't grand in the way of fancy buildings, no arches or polished brass, but it had a certain weight to it. A presence. The walls were solid timber, the roof high and well thatched, the porch wide and swept clean. A barn stood off to the side, doors closed tight. A windmill creaked slowly in the yard. There were no lights in the windows. No voices. No warmth. Just a kind of order. Clean, lonely order. Inside it smelled faintly of firewood, coffee, and something long since faded. Maybe tobacco, maybe soap, maybe memory. The floors were clean. The shelves lined with books too neat to have been touched in years. One chair sat by the fire, the cushion barely indented. On the mantel, a single framed photograph too dusty to see clearly. Nathan led her down a hallway and opened a narrow door. "This room's yours," he said. "Basins there, linens in the chest. I keep the stove fed. Don't waste wood." She stepped inside. It was simple, almost sparse, but clean and warm. After the wind on her face and the ache in her spine, it felt like being given a second chance at something she hadn't dared to name. "Thank you," she said quietly. Nathan only nodded. "Supper's at 6. You'll work off your sentence with labor. I don't run a charity, but I don't mistreat people either. You'll find I don't ask more than what's fair." He didn't say more, just left her standing there, arms still folded around herself. That night she couldn't sleep. Not for lack of comfort, the bed was soft enough, the room warm. But the dreams came anyway. She saw the cave again. The fire had gone out. Matthew was shaking Daniel awake, only Daniel wasn't waking. And when Eleanor screamed his name, the wind took her voice and scattered it across the mountains like ash. She sat up, hand pressed to her stomach, breath coming too fast. Dawn came gray and quiet. By mid-morning, she'd helped split kindling behind the barn and mended a torn saddlebag without complaint. Her hands were slow but steady, her breath short but constant. Nathan, for his part, didn't hover. He came and went, mostly silent sometimes, watching from a distance, not with suspicion, but something quieter. Habit, maybe. She caught him once standing by the edge of the porch with his coat open, eyes on the horizon like he was waiting for something he knew wouldn't come. At midday, over coffee and dry biscuits, he finally asked, "Why'd you steal?" She looked up, startled not by the question but the way he asked it, not accusing, not curious, just tired, like a man asking because something inside him wouldn't let him leave it alone. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She thought about lying something simple, palatable, but what was the point? "My name's Eleanor Hayes," she said slowly. "I was a nurse, field medic back during the war, met my husband in a makeshift hospital tent in Virginia. We made it through, mostly." She sipped her coffee. The warmth bit her tongue. She kept talking. "After the war, we tried to settle. It was never easy, but we made do. Then I saw something I shouldn't have. At a small clinic in St. Louis, a man died under care, a veteran. I knew it wasn't right. The doctor who'd treated him was dirty, sold medicine for whiskey money, left soldiers to rot." Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. "I reported it, or tried to. He had friends, people with power. Next thing I knew, they came for my husband, made up charges, said he'd falsified records, stolen equipment. They hung him before I even understood what was happening." Her voice didn't crack. She wasn't crying. She'd done all that already in another town, another life. "I ran," she finished. "Didn't have time to think. I was carrying. Made it to the mountains. Found an old hunter's cave. Been raising my boys there since." Nathan said nothing for a long while. Then finally, "You didn't mention children before." "No," she said. "Didn't know what kind of man you were." He leaned back in his chair, eyes still fixed on her. "And now I still don't," she replied. "But you haven't hurt me. That's more than I've been able to say about most men in years." He looked down at the table. His hand, rough and scarred, tapped once against the wood like an old habit he didn't know he had. Then softly, "Where are they?" she told him. The ridge, the cave, what she left behind, the days it had been, the cold. She didn't beg, just laid it out plain. Nathan stood without a word, walked out the front door. She didn't ask where he went, didn't follow. Just sat in that quiet house staring at the empty fireplace, wondering how long it would take before that silence swallowed her whole again. Hours passed. When he returned, he didn't come alone. The ranch hand behind him rode hard and fast, bundled in layers, cheeks raw from cold. In front of him, wrapped tight in a wool blanket, was a boy older than Daniel, thinner than Matthew should have been. Another bundle, smaller, slumped, clung to him from the saddle horn. Eleanor ran before her feet even knew it. She reached the boys with a sound that wasn't quite a cry and wasn't quite a word. Just breath and disbelief and something like faith rising from the dead. Nathan stood back, watched her gather them close, watched her sob quietly into their hair. He didn't speak, didn't step forward, just leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, hat low. Inside him, something stirred. Not joy, not pride. Something slower, heavier. Like soil thawing after a long freeze. Like breath returning to a place that had long forgotten how to draw it. And in that moment he understood. This woman had come into his life like a storm, uninvited and inconvenient. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't here to take something from him. Maybe she'd returned something that had been lost for too long to name. The days that followed passed like cold breath on window glass, quiet, lingering, fragile. Eleanor spent most of her hours in the back room tending to her boys. Matthew, always the steadier of the two, had settled quickly. He was still wary of the house, the man, and the unfamiliar softness of a real bed, but he adapted the way children sometimes do when the danger is finally over. He watched everything with quiet eyes, helped his mother without being told, and rarely asked questions. But Daniel didn't get better. The boy had been too cold for too long, his cough deeper now, his skin hot to the touch, and Eleanor felt the old helplessness creep back in the same one that had visited her years ago when she'd held a soldier's hand as the light drained from his eyes because there were no more bandages, no clean water, and nothing left to pray with. She did what she could, crushed herbs into poultices, wiped his forehead with damp cloths, tried to get broth into him, but none of it seemed to take. His breaths came quicker by the hour, chest rattling like loose nails in a tin bucket, and every time he coughed it sounded like something deeper than just lungs. Nathan saw it. He didn't say anything for a while, just watched from the doorway, arms folded, jaw set. There was something in his eyes that wasn't cold, but it wasn't soft either. Just a man standing at the edge of a line he'd drawn for himself years ago, wondering if it still held. He could see the worry carving lines deeper into Eleanor's face, the tremble in her fingers when she wrung out the cloth the way she didn't look him in the eye unless she had to. He'd seen it before, dozens of times. In battlefield tents and makeshift hospitals, in mothers crouched over fevered boys with hands too steady for how badly they were breaking inside. It was the kind of fear that didn't make noise. It just stayed. That night, long after the children were asleep, or at least too weak to stir, Nathan stepped into the room with slow, quiet steps. He didn't ask permission. He just came close enough to see the boy's skin, to feel the heat coming off him in waves. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, lips tight, one hand on her belly, like she could shield all 3 children with just the weight of her palm. He spoke then, voice low. "This is pneumonia." She didn't look up, just nodded. "I know." He looked at her longer this time, not with suspicion, not with pity, just recognition. "Do you have anything stronger?" She gave the faintest shake of her head. "No, nothing that'll touch this." Nathan's hand dropped to his side. A slow breath left him. He stood there a while like the decision was dragging him through mud. Finally, he said, "I used to be a surgeon, during the war." That made her look up. "I didn't know," she said cautiously. "Didn't tell you," he answered. Silence filled the space between them again, but it was a different kind now, not hollow, not wary, just heavy. He took another breath. "I lost my wife, and a child, not long after I came back. I stopped practicing, figured I'd done enough." Eleanor didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She just looked at him, eyes wide and shining but not wet, and whispered, "Can you help him?" Nathan didn't answer right away. Then he pulled the chair closer to the bed and rolled up his sleeves. It took hours. He sent Matthew to heat water and Eleanor to gather what supplies she had left: a chipped basin, an old cloth, 2 clean rags, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey that had been meant for numbing nerves, not treating illness. Daniel drifted in and out, his breath ragged and skin red with fever, but Nathan moved with the kind of calm that comes from doing something so many times it's carved into your bones. He worked in silence, checking the boy's lungs, draining fluid where he could, easing his posture so breathing wasn't a battle, keeping Eleanor steady with short instructions when her hands started to shake. The night dragged on long and tight with tension until the boy's fever finally broke, not all at once, but slow like thawing ice on a river. Eleanor sat by the bed with Daniel's hand in hers, staring at him like she couldn't quite believe he was still breathing. Nathan stood, rolled his sleeves back down and said simply, "He'll need rest, but he'll make it." She looked up at him, then really looked. He nodded once, then stepped back into the hallway and closed the door. He didn't sleep that night, didn't even try. Just sat by the cold hearth in the front room, a blanket around his shoulders, staring into nothing. The memories stirred, the old ones, the tent, the screams, the stillness that followed when the pain didn't. A small hand that never moved again. He thought of Daniel's fingers gripping Eleanor's in the dark and felt something crack open quietly inside. The days that followed were slow and quiet. Daniel slept most of the time, but the coughing eased and his skin lost that dry, too-hot flush. Matthew stuck close to his mother's side, helping without needing to be asked, watching Nathan from the corners of the room but never saying much. Eleanor, for her part, didn't say thank you, not in words, but she started tidying the house room by room. She swept corners that hadn't seen a broom in months. She aired out blankets, mended torn hems, organized the pantry. She found the small bookshelf near the fireplace, brushed the dust from the spines, and chose one with faded print to read aloud to Matthew in the evenings while Daniel slept. Her voice was soft, almost shy at first, but sure. It had the steady rhythm of someone who had read to children in darker places before. She started a little garden bed just past the porch, digging into frozen dirt with slow determination. She didn't ask permission, just did it like someone reclaiming the smallest patch of peace for herself. Nathan didn't stop her, didn't help either, but he watched. Watched the way she moved through the house, not like someone passing through, but like someone settling in, like someone who didn't expect to be chased off. That unsettled him more than he liked to admit. He had spent years making the house quiet. Not in a bad way, just in a safe way. Predictable. Empty. Grief was easier to carry when no one else was around to see it sag on your shoulders. Now there were fingerprints on the glass, crumbs on the table, small voices in the morning, and laughter, real clumsy, uneven laughter, had started to echo faintly down the hallways again. And still she hadn't told him. He wasn't a fool. He had seen the way she pressed a hand to her belly when she bent down. The softness of her middle wasn't from soup and rest. He could guess what it was. The way she moved, the way she looked off when she thought no one was watching, like someone who carried more than just a child. But he didn't ask. Not because he didn't want to know. Because he knew that whatever the answer was, it came wrapped in something too heavy for words. And sometimes the best thing a man can do is give someone space enough to hold their pain without making them bleed it out in front of you. She noticed, of course, the way he didn't look too close, the way he gave her room. And she began to look at him differently, not softer, not yet, but without fear, without suspicion. There was a quiet understanding forming between them, not spoken, not even fully recognized, but real. One evening, while Daniel and Matthew slept, and she folded clean linens at the kitchen table, she spoke without looking at him. "I didn't mean for any of this." Nathan was at the stove pouring hot water into 2 cups. "I know," he said simply. She folded another cloth. "I thought if I could just make it through the winter, things might be different." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. They still might. Silence again. Then she added, "The baby. It's not my husband's." He turned gently, set the cups down on the table, and met her eyes. She held his gaze. Brave, tired, but not ashamed. He didn't flinch, didn't judge. "Doesn't matter," he said. She blinked. "You're not going to ask, no." She looked down at her hands. Why Nathan picked up his cup, warming his palms against it. "Because I've done things I never wanted to explain to anyone either." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased, and for the first time she smiled, small, worn, but real. He saw it, and in that small gesture something in him settled like dust after a long storm. Life didn't change all at once on the Blackwood Ranch. It changed the way winter turns to spring out on the plains. Slow, uneven. A warm day here, a cold snap there. The kind of shift you don't notice till the wind smells different and the birds come back without announcement. That was how it went between Nathan and Eleanor. There were no sudden closenesses, no soft glances that lingered longer than they should, no touches meant to say more than they needed to. They kept things simple the way folks who've seen too much often do. But still, something was different. It showed in small ways, Nathan closing the chicken coop without a word when Eleanor forgot, and her finding his old work shirt folded neat on the foot of his bed, the elbow patch stitched back by careful hands. It showed in how she started leaving warm bread on the stovetop without asking if he wanted it, and how he made sure the boys' boots were left by the fire so they'd be warm come morning. There were still long silences, sure, but they weren't heavy anymore. They felt like space being given, not distance being kept. Daniel and Matthew, meanwhile, didn't seem to know they weren't kin. It started with Daniel one morning tugging on Nathan's pant leg while the man checked the woodpile. Mr. Nathan, the boy, said serious, "As a preacher, can I call you Uncle Nathan?" Looked down at him. That little face, pink with cold eyes, wide and honest, and just nodded once. "If your mama says it's all right." She said yes. Daniel grinned, though it wasn't true he hadn't asked her at all. But she didn't correct him when she heard it later, just smiled and brushed the boy's hair back from his forehead. After that, it was Uncle Nathan every time. At first, it sounded strange echoing through the hallways, but by the third or fourth week, it settled in like it had always been there. Matthew followed slower. He was more cautious by nature and older by just enough to remember what it felt like to lose things that mattered. But even he started to sit closer to Nathan in the evenings, watching the man with quiet curiosity, while pretending to read the same sentence over and over in an old dog-eared book. The evenings became their own kind of rhythm. A fire burning steady, the four of them gathered near the hearth, Eleanor mending clothes or writing letters. She never sent Matthew reading aloud when asked. Daniel curled up with a quilt and his thumb halfway to his mouth, always pretending not to be tired. And Nathan in his rocker by the window, watching it all with a kind of stillness that didn't feel lonely anymore. Sometimes Eleanor would laugh, a sound Nathan hadn't realized he missed until it came back sudden and soft and real, and he'd catch himself smiling before he knew he was doing it. Sometimes Nathan would talk not long stories, just memories that slipped out while he whittled or stirred his coffee. Tales about how the land used to be before the war, about his first dog, about the time the well froze clean through and he had to chip water off the rocks for a week. And in all of it, there was a warmth that hadn't lived in that house for years. Not since the days when a different voice had called out from the kitchen and a pair of tiny booties had waited by a cradle that never rocked. Then came the snowstorm. It rolled in fast from the north, heavy clouds stacking up like cattle at a bottleneck, bringing a wind so sharp it cut through barn wood and bit at the eaves of the house. Nathan had seen weather like this before, but not in years, the kind of storm that settles in your chest before it touches the ground. They bolted the windows, brought the animals in tight, hauled extra wood to the porch. Eleanor cooked what she could ahead of time, stew and bread enough to ride out a few days. The boys were giddy at first, pressing their hands to the frosted windows, watching the world disappear into white. By dusk, the wind was howling through the trees like something alive, and snow had swallowed the steps whole. That night, they lit every lamp burned through half a cord of wood and tucked the boys into the warmest corner of the main room. Eleanor had just started to doze off in a chair, a hand on her belly, when she sat up fast, both hands going straight to her side. She didn't cry out, didn't scream, just breathed hard, sharp, and grabbed the edge of the table to keep herself from sliding to the floor. Nathan was across the room in 2 long strides. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, calm but firm. She didn't answer at first, just looked at him, eyes wide, skin pale. Then she nodded once. "It's time." The words dropped like stones between them. Nathan glanced toward the window, wind screaming snow piling against the door, then toward the boys asleep in the far corner. They couldn't get help. Not now. Not tonight. He didn't panic, didn't flinch. He only said, "I'll boil water." Eleanor's knees buckled then, and Nathan caught her before she hit the floor. He lifted her with the same ease he'd once used to carry wounded men from battlefield trenches. She was lighter than she should have been, shaking all over, but didn't fight him. He brought her to the kitchen where it was warmest and laid her down on the quilted bench beneath the window. The firelight flickered across her face, sweat already rising on her brow. She gritted her teeth and gave a sharp, pained laugh. "Well," she muttered, "that didn't take long." Nathan, already moving, fetching towels, water, the small tin box of herbs from the shelf, said nothing. "You done this before?" she asked between breaths. He nodded. "Too many times. Ever with a woman screaming at you?" He glanced down at her, a corner of his mouth twitching. "Most of them did." She smiled, then groaned, grabbing the edge of the bench. Time moved strange after that. Not fast, not slow, just thick. Nathan worked with steady hands, soft voice and quiet authority, guiding her through every breath, every shift, every fear. He didn't ask questions, didn't let doubt in. He just stayed with her like a tree in a storm, still rooted steady. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the room was filled with sweat and firelight, and the kind of silence that holds its breath just before something breaks open. then a cry. Small, wet, alive. Nathan wrapped the child in a blanket, his big hands shockingly gentle. "It's a girl," he said softly. Eleanor let out a laugh that turned into a sob. He brought the baby to her, placed the bundle in her arms, and stepped back. She held the girl close, tears running unchecked down her cheeks, her whole body shaking with relief and gratitude, and something bigger than both. "She's here," Eleanor whispered. "She made it." Nathan stood by the stove looking at the mother and child, and felt something deep in his chest loosen like a knot that had been there so long he forgot what it felt like not to carry it. "What will you call her?" he asked, voice low. Eleanor looked up at him, then down at the baby, tiny, blinking warm. "Hope," she said. "Her name's Hope." Nathan didn't speak for a long while, but he nodded, and in the flickering firelight something softened behind his eyes. Not grief, not sorrow, just stillness, the kind that follows after long, hard waiting, the kind that feels a little like peace. The days after the snowstorm passed with a calm so quiet it felt unnatural. The sky cleared, the wind softened, and the earth, still blanketed in snow, shimmered like a fresh start. Hope, tiny, red-faced, and fussy, slept most of the time in a small cradle Nathan had crafted with his own hands from scrap pine and old memory. Eleanor moved slowly, recovering her steps, cautious but steady. The boys helped when they could, Matthew fetching wood, Daniel holding the baby's hand like she'd stop breathing if he let go. Nathan kept his distance in a way that still let her know he was close. There was warmth in the silence now, the kind you didn't rush, the kind that felt earned. Then came the letter. It arrived folded in thirds, stamped with a seal from the territory offices in Billings, carried by a rider Nathan didn't recognize. He took it from the man without a word, watched him ride off, and stood a long while on the porch before opening it. Inside were only a few lines, formal, stiff, and dangerous. Judge Elias Dunbar to visit redemption on matters of federal concern. Expected arrival within the week. Nathan read it twice, then once more. He didn't need to ask Eleanor about the name. He remembered it well enough from that night she'd sat at the kitchen table, hands clenched tight around a chipped cup, voice shaking as she told him the truth about what she'd seen about the doctor, the war, the husband taken in her place. And Dunbar, that was the man who'd pulled the strings. That evening after the children were asleep, he handed her the letter. She didn't speak for a long time after reading it. Her fingers trembled not much, but enough for him to see. "I never thought he'd find me out here," she whispered. "Not after all this time." "He's not here yet," Nathan said calmly. "But he will be," she replied, setting the letter down like it might bite. "And when he sees me, there won't be questions. He'll twist the truth like he always has. Say I deserted my post, accused a respected man, left the army without clearance." Nathan watched her closely. The panic in her voice was real, but beneath it there was a resignation that made his jaw tighten. "You're thinking of running," he said plainly. "I have to," she answered, looking toward the door as if the storm might already be out there. "He'll drag me back east, and they won't care what I say. I'll be lucky to make it to trial. You've got a baby now, 2 boys, and you're still healing. Where would you go?" Her silence was answer enough. Nathan stood, walked across the room, and leaned against the wall. The fire cracked behind him. He spoke slowly, careful to weigh each word. "You're not alone anymore, Eleanor." She looked up, uncertain. He stepped closer. "This house isn't just a roof over your head, and I'm not just the man who brought you home from a noose." She said nothing, but her eyes filled, and he could see it, the fear, the shame, the guilt of needing someone. "I don't expect you to trust easy," he added, "but you don't have to run. Not now, not ever again." She breathed in deep, still scared, but for the first time not frozen by it. "I can't ask you to get involved," she said softly. "You didn't," Nathan replied. "I'm already in." There was a pause, heavy and still, before he added the words that sealed it. This time, I run with you. Over the next 2 days, Nathan wrote letters. He reached out to men he hadn't spoken to in years. Old surgeons, field captains, army clerks who owed him a favor or two. He asked for documents, for witness names, for anything that could confirm Eleanor's version of events. Not gossip, not sympathy. Proof. Eleanor watched him work quiet and uncertain. Every now and again she'd bring him tea or place a blanket over his shoulders when the night dragged long. She didn't say much, but she didn't leave his side either. By the time Judge Dunbar's wagon arrived at the edge of redemption, the rumors had already done their work. Whispers spread quick in a town that small. The widow Hayes is a wanted woman. Nathan Blackwood's harboring a criminal. That baby ain't even his. The saloon buzzed with it. The general store, too. The same people who'd nodded politely a week before now crossed the street when Eleanor passed. Nathan didn't blink. He requested a town meeting at the old church, sent word to the sheriff and the mayor. Said it was a matter of truth. Said he'd speak with or without an audience. When the day came, the room was full. Dunbar stood at the front, tall and self-important, his black coat dusted with road grit. He didn't look at Eleanor once, not when she entered, not when she sat, not when Nathan stepped forward with a folder in hand. Nathan's voice was slow, clear, and steady. He laid it all out. The reports, the letters, the records from the war showing the pattern of missing medicine, the deaths blamed on unknown causes, the signatures traced back to Dunbar's own hospital post. He spoke without anger, without dramatics, just the facts. The crowd shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward. Others folded their arms tight with doubt. Dunbar tried to interrupt, once called it character assassination. Nathan held up a letter. It was from a dying soldier written 3 days before his death. A man Eleanor had tried to save. A man who'd written her name and the words, "She told the truth." That quieted the room. And when Nathan turned to Eleanor, standing pale but proud near the back, he said, "This woman isn't a deserter. She's a witness. And the only crime she ever committed was surviving." The silence that followed was thick. Then slowly a murmur, unsure at first, but growing. Dunbar stood red-faced and furious, threatened legal action, demanded a federal inquiry. But his voice didn't carry the same authority it once did. By nightfall, he was gone. Chapter 6. Sun after snow. They didn't throw a party. No one brought flowers, no speeches were made. But in the little cabin on Blackwood land with the fire burning and 3 children eating warm stew at the table, it felt like something bigger than any celebration. Eleanor didn't cry when she was cleared. She just stood there, her hand tight in Nathan's, and looked like someone who'd come up for air after holding her breath too long. Later that evening, with the wind quiet and the sky clear, Nathan finally did what he hadn't done in years, stood in front of the fireplace and pulled out a box from the shelf above. Inside were medals, letters, old photos. He laid them gently on the table, and Eleanor came to stand beside him. "You were a good doctor," she said softly. "I tried to be." She picked up one letter written in fine, slanted script. "I didn't know you'd saved so many. I didn't know how to keep the one that mattered most," he said. She turned to him, hand still on the letter. "You saved me," she said. "All of us." He didn't speak, so she stepped closer, her voice barely more than breath. "You're the best man I've ever known, Nathan Blackwood." He looked at her then, and in his eyes was a kind of peace she hadn't seen before, like something inside him had finally come to rest. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. Hope stirred in her cradle. The boys chased each other down the hallway. The stew simmered on the stove, and in that quiet golden light the house that had once been cold felt full not just of people, but of something older and deeper. Belonging. That night they ate at the table together. Just the 5 of them. No guests, no toasts, just buttered bread, hot soup, laughter, and peace. A peace earned not through war or wealth or power, but through love, slow, quiet, and real, like spring coming back to a land long frozen. Nathan Blackwood never fancied himself a man of grand gestures. He didn't own silver cufflinks, never learned the way of poetry, and had never knelt on one knee in his life unless it was to mend a fence post or tie the boot of a frightened soldier. But one morning, just before the sun had a chance to fully shake the frost off the fields, he stood on the porch beside Eleanor, both hands in his pockets, and asked, "Do you want to stay here for good, I mean?" Eleanor turned a little caught off guard. She squinted up at him, her hair tucked under a knitted shawl, her hands still holding the small basket she'd meant to take out to the hen house. She searched his face for the rest of the question, but that was all he said. He didn't say, "Marry me." He didn't promise the world. He just asked her plainly and honestly if she wanted to stay, and she nodded. She nodded once, firm, tearful, but calm, and let the basket drop to the porch floor. One hand went to her cheek where the tears were already falling, not from surprise, not even joy exactly, but from something quieter relief. Not because she was being asked to be someone's wife, but because finally, someone was asking her to belong. That was all she'd ever wanted. Not a title, not security, not safety, but a place to be rooted. A place where the ghosts of her past didn't chase her every morning. A home where her children laughed more than they flinched. Where she could grow something, a garden, a child, a life without fear that it would be taken away. Nathan didn't smile wide or pull her into an embrace. He simply stood beside her, both of them facing the horizon, where the light had just begun to warm the earth. And in that silence, she whispered the only words he needed. "Yes, I do." They didn't make a fuss about the wedding. No invitations. No lace-trimmed napkins or bands playing sweet-sounding hymns. What they had was a few neighbors, the McAndrews, who lent a kettle, and old Mrs. Dinley, who brought wildflowers from the edge of her fence. The saloon-keeper's wife offered to press Eleanor's old white dress, and one of the town seamstresses mended a tear in the hem, smiling as she did. Like this wasn't the same woman the town once whispered about. Matthew, with his hair combed slick and his boots too big, carried the rings. Daniel, proud and fidgeting, held Hope against his chest, swaying slightly on his tiptoes to keep her calm. She was dressed in the soft blue blanket Eleanor had stitched from leftover cloth months before. Nathan wore his father's coat. It smelled faintly of cedar and age and didn't fit right across the shoulders, but Eleanor thought he looked more himself in that moment than she'd ever seen him. Not stiff, not wary, just steady. They stood under the wide sky, the trees still holding clumps of melting snow on their bare branches, and said their vows with no preacher present, no Bible opened, no sermon read, only the land and a handful of witnesses who understood that sometimes love didn't arrive with a fanfare, it walked in quietly and stayed. "I reckon you're Mrs. Blackwood now," one of the neighbors said afterward, half laughing, half serious. Eleanor only smiled, not because of the name, but because of what it meant she had finally stopped running. That night the house felt different, not bigger, not grander, but fuller, like the walls had drawn closer to hold something worth keeping. Nathan lit the fire slower than usual. Eleanor rocked Hope to sleep with a soft hum that sounded more like a memory than a song. Daniel and Matthew, exhausted from the day, slept curled together on the braided rug, cheeks pink from laughter and cold. In the quiet that followed, Nathan poured 2 mugs of warm cider and sat beside Eleanor on the old couch. He didn't reach for her. He didn't rush. They didn't speak of the past that night. Instead, they spoke of tomorrow, of planting more vegetables in spring, of teaching Matthew how to ride, of carving a crib for Hope out of the maple tree that fell near the fence line. Small things, gentle things, the kinds of conversations people have when they finally believe they might have a future. Outside, the snow melted slow under the moonlight, and inside, a man and a woman, both long haunted, sat wrapped in a blanket of shared peace. When Nathan reopened the clinic, the sign hung out front didn't say much, just Dr. N. Blackwood hours by knock or need. It wasn't the same room he'd used years ago, back when his hands still shook at night from battlefield memories, and the town saw him as little more than a ghost. Eleanor helped clean it, swept out the dust, lined the shelves with glass jars, and stitched curtains from leftover linen. She didn't wear white anymore. Instead, she dressed in dark greens and navy colors that didn't draw attention, but felt sturdy, reliable. She moved around the clinic with quiet efficiency, her hands steady, her voice gentle but firm when she spoke to patients. Folks who'd once crossed the street to avoid her now brought their children to see her. And slowly the town forgot the rumors. Or maybe they didn't forget, but they forgave. "Funny how things turn," the blacksmith once said, sitting with a bandaged hand while Eleanor applied salve. "Reckon redemption's got its name for a reason." Daniel and Matthew started school the same week Nathan took in his first patient. The boys grumbled at first Daniel more than Matthew, but they came home each day with flushed cheeks and stories of spelling bees, marbles, and a teacher who always smelled like peppermint. Hope, now chubby-cheeked and curious, took her first steps in the hallway outside the clinic. Eleanor caught her just before she tumbled into a stack of books, laughing as she scooped the baby up. "She's trouble," Nathan said, watching from the doorway. "She's yours," Eleanor replied with a grin. He didn't argue. Some nights Eleanor would catch herself standing in the doorway of their bedroom watching Nathan read aloud from a dog-eared medical journal, glasses perched low on his nose. She'd see Hope asleep across his chest, his hand resting gently on her back, and feel something that almost frightened her. Not fear exactly, but something deeper. The realization that happiness, true happiness, didn't always come in a burst. Sometimes it crept in slowly, like spring thaw, like forgiveness. She still dreamt of her first husband now and then. But the dreams had changed. He no longer looked scared, no longer reached for her, begged her to run. In the last dream, he stood under a tree in a sunlit field, smiling, peaceful. He kissed her forehead, handed her baby Hope, and turned away without a word. She woke with tears on her cheeks, and Nathan's arm already around her. That morning, she didn't speak of it. She just held him longer than usual, her hands resting flat on his chest, as if anchoring herself there. Late that summer, the children helped plant herbs behind the house: lavender, chamomile, mint. Eleanor taught Hope to dig with a spoon, showed her which leaves to smell and which to leave alone. Nathan whittled toy horses for Daniel and Matthew on the porch, humming a tune he didn't quite remember the words to. By the time autumn rolled in, folks in town had stopped calling her that widow woman. Now they just said Mrs. Blackwood. And Nathan. He no longer drifted from room to room like a man half alive. He moved with purpose now, with direction. And though he didn't say much, it was clear in the way he reached for Eleanor's hand in the dark, or kissed Hope's forehead before leaving the house, or knelt to help Daniel with a broken wagon wheel that he'd found something worth living for again. They never left redemption. They didn't need to. They'd already run long enough. Now they had roots in the soil, in the walls, in each other. And on one quiet morning, with the garden blooming and the wind just soft enough to rustle the curtains, Eleanor stepped out onto the porch and stood watching the scene before her. Nathan was down near the barn, Matthew and Daniel chasing chickens around his legs, Hope toddling after them with a stick twice her size. The sunlight caught the dust in the air, turning it gold, and Eleanor, standing there with her hands wrapped around a warm mug, felt something that once seemed impossible. She felt whole, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer owned her. Redemption. The town that once wanted her dead had become the place where she came alive again. A place of healing, a place of family, a place of love. And in the end, that was enough. And that, my friends, is the end of the story. Redemption. You know, I sat with this one longer than usual. Not because it was dramatic or filled with twists, though it sure had its moments, but because it made me feel something real. This wasn't just a Western. It wasn't just a love story. It was about healing, about second chances, about the quiet kind of courage it takes to stay when life has taught you to run. What hit me the hardest was how the story didn't need grand gestures or perfect people. It gave us broken folks, Eleanor, Nathan, who had every reason to shut the world out. and yet they let it in, slowly, carefully. And because of that, they found something rare: peace. The message here, that the past may shape us, but it doesn't get to define us. That sometimes family isn't just who you're born to, it's who stays when things fall apart. And that love, real love, isn't loud. It shows up quietly in small acts, in soup on the stove, in warm boots by the fire, in simply saying, "You're not alone anymore." I think in a world that often moves too fast, this story reminds us to slow down, to feel, to listen, to forgive. If this tale touched you in any way, I'd really love to hear what part hit home for you. Was it the snowy gallows, Nathan's quiet redemption, the birth of little hope? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. Truly. And if you've ever felt like life gave you too many storms, maybe this story reminds us that spring does come back. Thanks for watching. Stay warm, stay kind. I'll see you in the next one.